Keith Urban, the boy from the windy coasts of New Zealand who once held onto a guitar like it was a shield protecting him from fear, was never supposed to disappear among Nashville's crowded music halls, and with fire built from his wounds and a voice shaking with raw truth, he didn't just play country music, he completely changed it. Every time his guitar played, it was like lightning striking across the American heartland, and every word he sang carried the heavy weight of survival until Grammy Awards, platinum records, and sold-out stadiums all bowed down to a man who turned his scars into beautiful music. Nicole Kidman, born under Pacific skies and raised with Australian toughness, was not meant to be forgotten because she was born to change movies forever, going from a girl silenced by a stutter to a woman who disappeared into characters with terrifying depth, and she gave everything for every role until the Academy itself surrendered an Oscar into her hands. She didn't just act, she transformed, carrying audiences into worlds so fragile and fierce that silence followed her like respect in a church. When their worlds crashed together, it wasn't just a marriage but an alchemy of music and movies, two broken spirits daring to fuse into something larger than myth. A love story the world praised as unbreakable, yet behind the standing ovations, shadows gathered as relapses, silences, and griefs unseen by cameras clawed at their sanctuary, testing a union once believed eternal. And now at 57, Keith Urban has finally spoken, admitting the truth about his marriage, and after nearly 19 years together, the fairy tale has ended not in scandal but in silence, dignity, and the cruel ache of farewell. Before the love story, before the marriage that once dazzled Hollywood as unshakable, before the Grammys and the thunder of fame, there was only a boy, barefoot, breathless, and already drowning in storms no child should endure. Keith Lionel Urban entered the world on October 26, 1967 in Whangarei, New Zealand, but destiny offered him no stillness, and at just 2 years old, his family moved to Caboolture, Queensland, chasing a better life that never arrived, and what followed was not shelter but fire, relentless and merciless. At 9 years old, Keith stood in the street as his childhood home was eaten up by flames that crawled up the walls like living beasts, and photographs curled into smoke, toys melted into liquid shadows, and every dream he had turned to ash in a single night. The smell of burning would stuck in the air, the crack of collapsing beams echoed like gunfire, and a boy stood frozen, holding on to nothing but fear, while neighbors rushed forward with boxes of second-hand clothes, strangers whispering mercy into the chaos. Years later, Keith would remember in a trembling voice, "All we had left was each other and the kindness of strangers who reminded me that not all things burn." But the fire outside was only a reflection of the darker blaze within his own home. His father, Robert Bob Urban, was a man of violent extremes, a passionate lover of country music, yet an unpredictable alcoholic whose silence and fury smothered the house like smoke, and the same man who first placed a guitar in Keith's hands also placed terror in his heart. Affection was absent, tenderness was a stranger, and the words every child longs to hear never came, and "I don't remember him ever saying he loved me," Keith confessed years later, with each word shaking like a confession of a wound still open. That absence was not just sorrow, it was devastation, and nights at home were suffocating with the slam of a door cracked like thunder and silence weighed heavier than fists. And yet in the rubble of that chaos, a fragile gesture flickered when Bob taped a handwritten sign to the window of his shop that said, "Guitar teacher wanted for my son," and that sign became salvation. It led young Keith to Sue McCarthy, the teacher who became his first safe harbor, the first soul to believe in him, and at 4 he strummed a ukulele. At 6 he held a guitar not like a toy but like armor strapped to a fragile body, and in a house ruled by chaos, the guitar was never just an instrument but a shield, a voice, a lifeline clutched by a boy desperate to survive. Through his teenage years, Keith poured everything into strings and chords with a desperation the world mistook for discipline, and at Tamworth festivals, standing beside Jenny Wilson, he collected awards like the Golden Guitar, dazzling audiences who saw only brilliance, never the fracture beneath. But behind every standing ovation stood a boy still gasping for air, still running from the silence of home, and nights stretched in smoky pubs as his parents drove him from one gig to another while he played stages far too large for a heart still so broken. The applause roared like waves, but it never filled the hole inside, and later in a voice heavy with both gratitude and grief, Keith confessed, "Music saved me, it gave me somewhere to go when home didn't feel like home," and those words were not performance but a revelation carved out of agony. If Keith's childhood was forged in fire and fear, Nicole's began in silence, the kind of silence that convinces a child she does not belong and maybe never will. She entered the world on June 20, 1967 in the heavy humidity of Honolulu, Hawaii, while her father Anthony Kidman chased a Ph.D. in psychology and her mother Janelle Glennie pursued nursing with quiet determination, and though born on American soil, her heartbeat would grow on Australian ground where two cultures braided together inside her, often leaving her with eyes wide in awe but also with a gnawing sense of alienation. At just 3 years old, The Kidman family returned to Sydney, where Nicole and her younger sister Antonia were raised in a home that from the outside looked like a sanctuary of intellect and compassion. But Nicole carried a storm with no name, only silence, as she was painfully shy, with her voice strangled by a stutter that choked her words before they could escape. "I remember being terrified of speaking up, as if my voice didn't belong to me," she would confess years later, recalling the hollow loneliness of those years when she was a child surrounded by brilliance yet locked inside an invisible cage where no one could hear her cries. And yet even in that silence, a doorway cracked open when at just 3, Nicole discovered ballet, where music and movement flowed through her small body like a secret language of freedom, and on the stage she was no longer the trembling child with downcast eyes but a spirit unchained. But the world outside the stage was merciless, because her tall frame, fiery curls, and porcelain skin made her stand out like a flame in a dark room, a flame others tried to snuff out with cruel laughter, and whispers followed her in school hallways while mocking glances cut deeper than knives until the sense of being the other became her shadow. Yet Nicole refused to collapse beneath it, as she turned alienation into strength, and out of isolation, empathy bloomed, while out of mockery, resilience hardened. Her parents, seeing both her fragility and her brilliance, guided her into the Australian Theatre for Young People, the place that would transform her life, and among dusty scripts and harsh stage lights, she met Naomi Watts, a bond that would last a lifetime. But even more importantly, Nicole found the first true echo of her own voice. "It was the first time I felt I belonged somewhere," she recalled, her words trembling with both relief and memory, as if a door that had been locked her entire life had finally opened. Keith Urban's climb from child prodigy to global country icon was never instant or easy, but a brutal road carved not by privilege but by rejection, resilience, and a faith so reckless it bordered on desperation. At only 8 years old, while most children still played with toys, Keith stood beneath dim lights on shaky stages in smoke-filled pubs and dusty fairgrounds, with a guitar nearly larger than his body strapped against him like armor, and the smell of stale beer clung to the air while the sting of cigarette smoke burned his lungs, and strangers shouted over his music as though daring him to keep playing. By 15, the gift was undeniable, as his fingers danced with the precision of a master, but his eyes carried the exhaustion of a soul already weathered by too much pain, and on New Faces in 1983 and in duets with Jenny Wilson, he stunned audiences, his golden guitar at Tamworth proof that brilliance lived inside him. In 1992, he leaped into the void, abandoning homeland, family, and every shred of security for Nashville, a decision less about ambition than defiance, a silent war against every voice that had told him he wasn't enough. "I knew no one, I had no plan B," he confessed, remembering nights in rented rooms where loneliness pressed against him like a second skin, and Nashville was merciless, as doors didn't close politely, they slammed. 7 years passed before the storm finally broke, when in 1999 his self-titled American debut emerged like a spark in the dark, and when, but for the grace of God, soared to #1, it wasn't just a hit on the charts but resurrection, proof that scars could be turned into music, that a boy forged in fists, fire, and silence could rise not by chance or luck, but by surviving every storm that had once tried to silence him. Fame did not arrive quietly for Keith Urban but crashed into his life like a storm long overdue, and after years of being unknown and heartbroken in Nashville, 1999 became the reckoning with his self-titled American debut, and from that moment he didn't just rise, he erupted. In 2002, Somebody Like You shattered records, later crowned by Billboard as the biggest country hit of the decade, and the world had finally caught up to the sound Keith had carried alone for years, music born of pain, rejection, and a stubborn will to survive. But success did not heal the wounds, it made them bigger under crueler lights. With Be Here in 2004, he delivered powerful songs like Days Go By and Making Memories of Us, cementing not just his place in country music but reshaping its very DNA by mixing twang, rock, and pop into something raw and uncontainable. Albums went triple platinum, arenas thundered with sold-out crowds, and awards rained down with 4 Grammys, 15 ACMs, and 13 CMAs. Yet behind the trophies, Keith would sometimes stare into the mirror after a show, wondering if the man staring back was truly worthy or merely surviving on borrowed time. Long before Nicole Kidman ever walked into his life, before Grammys glittered on his shelf or stadiums thundered his name, Keith Urban had already placed his heart, his hope, and his future in the hands of another woman, and watched it all collapse beneath the same demons that nearly destroyed him, and her name was Laura Sigler. For almost a decade she carried his brokenness as if it were her own, holding together a love that began with laughter and tender dreams but ended in a silence so crushing it could splinter the strongest bones, and what should have been vows spoken beneath flowers became instead a farewell whispered in the dark as they're forever drowned under the weight of Keith's most merciless enemy, addiction. They met in the late 1980s when Keith was just a boy in his early 20s playing to half-empty pubs in Queensland with guitar strings ringing through smoke and beer-soaked air, and Laura saw what others ignored, Not just a musician clawing for recognition, but a young man burning from the inside out as if each note was a desperate prayer for survival. By the mid-1990s she wore his ring not as ornament but as a promise, and through failure, through slammed doors, through the abyss of uncertainty, she would remain, or so they thought, but dreams weigh heavy and demons heavier still. The end did not explode but unraveled, and one night Laura found him slumped in shadow with his guitar abandoned in the corner and his eyes hollow, and with tears carving lines down her cheeks. She slipped off the engagement ring, placed it gently on the table, and whispered the words she had fought for years not to say, "I can't do this anymore." While Keith was losing the woman who had carried his brokenness for nearly a decade, Nicole was stepping into what she believed would be her forever, a love so dazzling it blinded her to the shadows already gathering beneath it. At just 23 on the set of Days of Thunder in 1990, she met Tom Cruise, and to her it was lightning, sudden, searing, undeniable, as he wasn't just a co-star but the axis around which her entire world began to spin. Together they became Hollywood's golden illusion with hands interlaced on red carpets and smiles shining like perfect masks. But behind those blinding flashbulbs, Nicole endured heartbreaks so private the world never saw her break as miscarriages hollowed her, leaving her staring into the silence of an empty crib, whispering prayers to a God who would not answer. Out of that grief she reached for salvation in motherhood, and with Tom she adopted Isabella in 1992, then Connor in 1995, children who became her lifeline, but in giving everything she was slowly surrendering herself until her choices ceased to be her own. The end did not arrive with thunder, but with a whisper sharp enough to wound when in 2001 Nicole came home to find her life erased with a single act as Tom had filed for divorce with no warning, no final plea, only absence. By 2005 both had walked through their private ruins as Keith, scarred by addiction and loneliness, stood on stages roaring with thousands yet felt utterly unseen, while Nicole, hollowed by divorce and estrangement from the children she had once poured her soul into, hid her grief behind the shine of red carpets, and neither was whole, neither was ready. And yet when they met that January at a Hollywood gala, something unspoken passed between them, not lightning or spectacle but a quiet recognition that here was another survivor. Keith would later admit it took him 4 months to call her, paralyzed by awe and self-doubt, but when he finally did, their bond grew in silence and depth far from headlines as Nicole did not fall for the music or the fame but saw the wounded man still trying to heal, and Keith for the first time allowed himself to be seen. A year later on June 25, 2006, they stood in a candlelit church in Sydney, and to the world it was a fairy tale, but to Keith it was salvation as he would later say, "I truly began living when I married her," yet the vows were tested almost immediately. Just 4 months after their wedding Keith relapsed, sinking into the very darkness he had sworn to leave behind, and Nicole could have walked away, but instead she staged an intervention, gathering friends, doctors, and her own unwavering courage, and she looked at him not with judgment but with love that refused to abandon him. Recovery brought clarity and clarity brought new life when in 2008 Nicole gave birth to their first daughter Sunday Rose, and for a woman who had endured miscarriages and the ache of empty cribs, holding her newborn was nothing short of a miracle, and in 2010 through surrogacy came Faith Margaret, her miracle from another woman. For nearly 2 decades they built a life together brick by brick, balancing blazing careers with fragile everyday rhythms as Keith wrote songs in the kitchen while Nicole read scripts by the fire, and they walked through their Nashville home hand in hand, choosing simplicity over spectacle. For 19 years they seemed unshakable, and yet even the strongest bonds can fray as what began as whispers in 2024 soon swelled into an echo the world could no longer ignore when Keith Urban had quietly moved out of the Nashville home they once built with laughter and lullabies. That house where piano keys once stumbled beneath tiny fingers, where the scent of pancakes filled Sunday mornings, where children's feet once pattered across wooden floors, now stood in an aching silence, and neighbors spoke of lights that once glowed past midnight now extinguished before dusk. And then in 2025 whispers hardened into truth when Nicole Kidman quietly filed for divorce in Tennessee on September 30, 2025, citing irreconcilable differences, and what had begun in candlelit vows was reduced to the cold language of custody agreements and asset division. Together they amassed a fortune as extraordinary as their fame, with Nicole carrying a net worth estimated at over $250 million and Keith carving a fortune nearing $75 million, and combined their wealth exceeded $325 million, an empire not just of money but of memories. Their real estate portfolio was sprawling with a farmhouse in Nashville, a harborside penthouse in Sydney, a Manhattan duplex with views of Central Park, and in Bunya Hill, Australia, a 111-acre estate where they sought silence away from cameras, and collectively their holdings were said to be worth over $50 million, each property a chapter of their life together. But now as the dust of courtrooms and contracts settles, one truth remains painfully clear: that no fortune, no mansion, no car, no award can mend the fracture of hearts left behind, not Keith's, not Nicole's, not even those of the daughters who never asked for any of this. Perhaps all that can be wished for them now is gentleness, that whether together or apart they may find peace, that the wounds of today may one day soften into memory, and that love in whatever form it survives continues to guide them forward. Because even if they never walk the same path again, the world will always hope they carry happiness in their hearts and that their daughters grow up knowing they were loved fiercely in every word spoken, every sacrifice made, every silent prayer whispered across those 19 years. And perhaps this ending is not the loss of hope but a reminder that love, even when it changes shape, still carries light forward.